Good now? There we go. All right. Well, before we begin, Brother Greg, will you open us up with a word of prayer?
God and Father in heaven, we're again thankful for this beautiful day that you've given us, for the time that we have to come together, one another as Christians, and study from your word. I pray that you'll be with us this hour, be with each teacher, be with us as listeners, and help us to grow in knowledge and understanding of your word. Thank you so much for all the blessings of life, for your Son who came to this earth and really gave his life that we might have remission of our sins and a hope of heaven. Pray, Father, that you would forgive us of any wrongs in our lives, that we might stand clean and pure once again in your sight. Be with us this hour for the rest of this day. May we bring glory and honor to your name. We ask this prayer in Christ's name. Amen.
Just one quick reminder about there it is, the lesson a week or a month from today, essentially, August the 16th. We'll be doing lessons 7 and 8. We'll be doubling up that one Sunday because of the gospel meeting this quarter, but then from that point onward, we'll just be doing one lesson per week. Now, one of the observations that I want to make at the very first of this study, I'm going to go through the questions first and then go back to the true and false questions. I did not appreciate the way that he's done this to us. I appreciate questions that lead us through the text. That's a whole lot easier for me to teach from. These were a little bit more difficult for me to combine and make sure that we're making our way through the text. So I tossed around a couple of different ideas in my own brain because I really want us to spend the time in John chapter 7, because there's a lot that's happening in John chapter 7 that is important not just to the gospel, but to also the ministry of Jesus that I wanted to spend some time with. So hopefully we can do a pretty decent job of that as we journey through. Now, when you look at the beginning of John chapter 7, I don't want us to overlook verse 1, because I think verse 1 really is the momentum that brings us into the chapter, and he overlooked that, or at least in this lesson, he did not have verse 1, and that ties into a couple of things. After these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. And the final phrase of that verse is the part of the verse that we really want to look at, is that the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now, when we think about the Jews who are seeking to kill him, what Jews primarily are seeking to destroy Jesus at this point in time? All right, the Pharisees immediately come to our minds. Who else? The Sadducees, the Herodians, the scribes, essentially those who would be the composite of the Sanhedrin Council, are the ones who are already intending to kill Jesus. Now, is this something that is new? No, this is something that they've been plotting long ago, earlier in Jesus' ministry, when Jesus would perform miracles and when he would teach. Those who were the religious elites, they were already being driven by their envy, by their jealousy, and as such, they were already seeking an avenue by which they could kill Jesus. So it should not surprise us that the Jews are seeking to kill Jesus. But there's a couple of groups in chapter 7 that I want us to, let's just go ahead and talk about that before we get to the brothers. So the first group that we want to focus in on in verse 11 is, so the Jews were seeking him at the feast. This is the same group of Jews spoken of in verse 1. And this is the same group of Jews, look at verse 13. Yet no one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews. So the Jews who are seeking to destroy Jesus are the same subset of the Jews that the people are afraid of. The people are afraid of them. Why? We're not given that necessarily in chapter 7. We're not given that until chapter 9, when the blind man's parents come in. They're unwilling to testify on his behalf because the Jews will do what? They'll throw us out of the synagogue. So the Jews are influencing the people. Now, so you have the Jews And it's easy for us when we read that, because it's so generic, we just read it as, well, this is the Jews in general. No, we're looking at a very subset of the Jews here. Now, there's another group that we want to look at, and that is verse 14. But when it was now in the midst of the feast, no, not verse 14. Let me go to my notes so that I can do a better job here. The second group, look at verse 12. That'd probably be better. So verse 11, the Jews. Verse 12, there was much grumbling among the crowds. Now, again, what's happening in Jerusalem in John chapter 7? All right, it's the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Feast of the Booths. So who's in Jerusalem for the Feast of the Booths? Well, all the males of the Jews were supposed to be there. So when we look at verse 12, what we're probably looking at is we're looking at everyone who has come from all the far distant lands back to Jerusalem. That's the contrast at the very beginning in John chapter 7, is you have the contrast of the Jews, then you have the crowds. And they're going to have vastly different reactions to Jesus. And there's one more group, verse 25. So some of the people of Jerusalem were saying. So you have the crowds from all the far distant lands. You have the Jews, who would predominantly more have been the religious elites. And then you have the Jews, or the people from Jerusalem. Those are the individuals who definitely have already been influenced by the Sanhedrin and by the Pharisees. And that spurs what they even talk about even in the context. So that's just some introduction to John chapter 7. I think it's going to help us as we journey through. But before we even get to those three groups, the first subset that we're given, the first group that we have in John chapter 7 that is unique, is the brothers. Now they come to Jesus, and I broke this first question up in two parts. How do you account for the fact that Jesus had shown himself to the world? Did I even title it? Is that what the question says, or did I mistype it? Oh, had not shown. Okay, well, I knew that. Well, either way. Okay, so what is this question? What's the answer to the question? All right, his time had not come. Let's just move through this. All right, how do Jesus' own brothers respond to his decision to remain in secret? All right, if you're not willing to do it publicly, well, then you must not be who you say you are. But what's the idiocy of that even statement from the brothers? Well, they don't believe. But had Jesus performed these things publicly? Yes. Multiple miracles have already transpired. Multiple miracles have taken place. And here, the brothers are just like the other Pharisees who in Matthew chapter 12 asked for another sign. Give us another sign. You know, I don't know why the brothers do not believe in Jesus at this point in time, other than jealousy, envy of themselves and of who Jesus is versus them. Now, we do know the name of some of those brothers. Matthew 13, James, Joseph, Simon, Judas are the names of some of those brothers. And then the third question in this section, what had primarily been the purpose of the miracles Jesus had performed up to this time?
I thought that it was to show that he was Son of God, the Messiah.
All right. To build faith. Therefore, many other signs Jesus performed in the presence of his disciples, but these have been written so that you may what? Believe. So, when we think about the purpose of miracles, we have to begin right then and there. John 20 and verses 30 and 31. The purpose of miracles are to promote faith. And then going back to what Brother Mann, what you were saying, I think about Mark chapter 16 there, the confirmation of the messages that were being relayed, they're confirmed by the miracles that transpired. So Jesus has done this throughout his ministry. He's done this in all of these various different ways, but yet the people are unwilling to accept him.
Now, what miracles have he actually done in Jerusalem?
What miracle? Well, we know John chapter 5 he did in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, sir.
Was the brothers, have they witnessed any of Jesus' miracles, or they're asking, they want another sign?
I can't say that they were asking for another sign because that's me imposing upon the text. I was just saying that why are they asking him to do this publicly? And Jesus, understanding his time frame, his hour has not yet come. But I love what Jesus does say, but your hour is always opportune. He's like, hey, if you want notoriety, go ahead and you can go get that yourself. But when I think about the brothers' inability, again, and this is one of the major things that goes on throughout John chapter 7 and John chapter 8, and that is the origin of Jesus. And if you don't catch on to it this week in preparing for today's class, I would go back and reread John 7 and 8 specifically together and really focus in on how much is said about Jesus' origin. Where did Jesus come from? Because that's I think even that ties in with the brothers, is the brothers do not fully believe that Jesus is who he says because they grew up with him. They don't want to see him as nothing more than just a full-blooded brother, but Jesus wasn't a full-blooded brother with them. He was a half-blood with them because his father was not Joseph, his father was God. Well, an interlude happens, in verse 10, Jesus, it just tells us that his brothers and himself, they went to the feast privately. Now, first, I do not believe that Jesus is speaking a half-truth or anything such as that. Go up for yourselves. I do not go up to the feast because my time is not fully come, verse 8. The literal, you can literally translate this not to mean that I do not go up, but I do not go up now. And I think that's the emphasis. Jesus is going to go up to Jerusalem because he's a faithful Jew. But he was not going to go up to Jerusalem at that point in time. That's the emphasis that we need to see there. Jesus is not lying by no means to his brothers when he says, I may not go up now, but I am going to go up. So the interlude, Jesus goes through Samaria. Now, why is Jesus, describe his reception in Samaria?
Poor.
All right, it's poor. Why?
Well, they were enemies of the Jews. Samaritans were. They rejected. That's when James and John wanted to destroy them.
All right, so the Samaritans didn't like the Jews just as much as the Jews did not like Jesus. Now, I think Jesus taking this route from Galilee to Jerusalem shows the haste in his trip, because the normal trip of the Jews of that day, they would have crossed the Jordan, gone down on the eastern side of the Jordan, and then crossed back over to stay away completely from the land of Samaria. But Jesus, knowing that he had already pressed his time with his younger brothers, when he had pressed his time there, he needed to get to Jerusalem quickly. Well, the shortest distance between 2 points is what? Straight line. Thank y'all. We all listen to our elementary math teachers on that. That's what Jesus is doing. Instead of going to the east and then coming back to the west, no, he's just going north-south here. He's going directly. And now, this isn't the only time Jesus goes through Samaria. In John chapter 4, when Jesus went through Samaria, leaving Jerusalem, how did the Samaritans receive him then? Very well. Why? What's the difference between John chapter 4 and John chapter 7? All right, John chapter 4 is the woman with the well story. But Jesus, he doesn't just speak to the woman at the well. He speaks to many of the Samaritans, and many of the Samaritans believe Jesus gave them time. He came to them in John chapter 4. He's not coming to the Samaritans in John chapter 7 or in Luke chapter 9. He's just making a highway through their land. He's just getting from point A to point B. Them knowing that, they saw him not as some magnificent person to be listened to, as in John 4. They saw him as just a pestering Jew, and they didn't want to have anything to do with him. All right, so that was Jesus' reception. Well, what's the attitude of James and John, the sons of thunder? Let's call down fire from heaven. Now, is that an example from do we find anything of that in the Old Testament? In 2 Kings chapter 1, where Elijah calls down fire from heaven against those who are being sent to him. I think there's a John and James here are saying, look, you have the power. We believe you have the power. Let's just do this. Let's call down fire upon these villages. Let's just snuff them out. Well, what was Jesus' reaction? All right, our mission is not to destroy. Our mission is to save. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which is lost. And that's what Jesus would ultimately do in Acts chapter 8 through his missionary Philip. The gospel would do what for the Samaritans? It would save them. So Jesus knowing the end in sight. All right, now we're looking at the Feast of the Tabernacles. Again, we're going to look at just the questions themselves, and we're just going to be kind of jumping through verses 11 all the way through the end of the chapter. But we've already given that introduction to the people that we're looking at, or at least the subsets of the people that we're looking at. But let's first look at this question. What is the Feast of the Tabernacles? All right, it's the Feast of the Ingathering, the Feast of Harvest. All right, so the one of the three. So what are the three feasts that all males were to arrive in Jerusalem? Passover, 50 days later, Pentecost, and then the Feast of the Booths, the Feast of Ingathering. What else do we know that's happening during this 7-day period? All right, it's a period of Thanksgiving because who has given them the crops that they are now laid by in store?
Why does he say in the book, the Feast of the Tabernacle came 6 months before and 6 months after Passover?
I think what he's emphasizing there is that we are now 6 months out from Jesus' final Passover. He began his commentary with it had been. Did he begin it in his commentary that it had been 18 months since Jesus had been in Jerusalem? It's just the middle part of the year. But we are now, that's how quickly you move in the ministry of Jesus. And you think about this, we're in July the 19th, and we have 6 months left of Jesus' life. Jesus does a lot of things toward the end, and really, when you think about all 4 of the Gospels, 25% of each of those Gospels is spent in the final week of Jesus' life. So there's a lot to be dealt with in that. But going back to the 18 months, I think Jesus is going to Jerusalem every feast because that's what Jesus would have done as a faithful male and a faithful Jew. But when you think about the 7th month, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, the Feast of Trumpets was observed, which is Rosh Hashanah, as we call it today. On the 10th day of the 7th month is the day of Atonement, Day of Atonement. And then the 15th through the 22nd day is the day of Feast of the Tabernacles. So it's a time of Thanksgiving. But there's something else. Let's just take tabernacle. Think about the word tabernacles, Feast of Tabernacles. What is the emphasis of the feast? What is it to remind them of? What they dwelt in for 40 years. It was a reminder to them of where God had brought them through the wilderness wanderings, and now he has brought them into the land. So, I mean, could you imagine for 7 days every year us leaving our homes and moving out into the backyard into a tent? I mean, does that make sense to any one of you? It'd been, yes, a whole lot easier. But I mean, it doesn't. But again, we've not gone through the wilderness. We don't have that same history as they do. All right. Anything else on the Feast of the Booths? Now, a couple other things. One of the things that I do think is very important for us to see, and it ties into verses 37 through 39, and it ties into John chapter 8 and verse 12. So every evening during this 7-day period of feast, they had erected 4 candles that would lift up from the woman's court of the tabernacle or the temple. And those candles were so high and so brightly lit that the light could then be seen in all of Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem sits on top of the hill. And these candles are to represent light being shown. So what's the emphasis there? Jesus uses that to say what in John 8 and verse 12? I am the light of the world. He uses that to represent. He says this is a physical of what I am spiritually to all people. And then also every morning and evening, if my memory serves me correct, the priest would go and take from the pool of, it may have been the pool of Siloam, and they would bring up and they would pour water out there in the temple courtyards. They're pouring water out. What is that represented of? Well, Jesus tells us that manifestation there in John chapter 7, 37 through 39. So both of those things that were being done on a daily basis of the Jews, Jesus takes those things and he gives them their greater meanings found through him. Well, why did the guards return without arresting Jesus? Here we jump all the way to the end of the chapter. They're amazing. I mean, any person that stood or sat or was in the presence of Jesus, and it's recorded for us in the Gospels, when Jesus gets done teaching, people are what? They're amazed. I mean, you take, just the puzzle pieces that we can fit together every so often, where we all just sit in amazement, not of any one particular teacher, but of the God's Word. Could you imagine having God's Word incarnate, taking those puzzle pieces and going, hey, you remember this, 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 and this. This is how I'm the fulfillment of those things. I think we would be in the same way. We would respond in amazement. But here, never has a man spoken the way this man speaks. To which the Jews are going to respond with what? Have you been deceived also? See, again, their hearts are so hardened, they are unwilling to even the ones that they've sent to arrest Jesus, the ones that they know are their trusted guards, they see and are so envious of Jesus.
They also knew that Jesus was a carpenter and that he had not been to the big university.
Mm-hmm. And at verse 15 of chapter 7, how is this man unlearned able to speak to us? Is that the only time the Sanhedrin's going to have a response to the gospel in that manner? So Luke chapter 2, Jesus had them there turning on their heads, and I think that's the imagery that you see there. And Jesus is questioning and answers there in Luke chapter 2, but then Acts chapter 4, verse 14, Peter and John, how are these unlearned, uneducated fishermen in Jerusalem telling us about all these things? How is this even possible? And then even in Acts chapter 26, I think it's verse 24, Paul is told, your learning has made you mad. Paul would say this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. He'd say that the foolishness of the cross is what? It's a stumbling block, but to those who is being saved, it is the power of God. And I think that's the emphasis that we can take there. Well, the question is I did one work and ye all marveled. Jesus is referring to what?
I think it's a healing of the man, going back to paralyzed man on the side.
All right. So I think it is John chapter 5. And if you're just reading John's gospel, not reading anything else, I think the parallel has to be the man who was healed on the Sabbath in John chapter 5. But when you even look at, the feeding of the 5,000, who was the primary audience of the feeding of the 5,000?
The northern tribe, around the area.
Draw it in even more. Who's the specific audience of the feeding of the 5,000? It's not just the Jews. I'm talking about the 12. You think about that. When Jesus performs that miracle, who knew where the food was coming from? Everybody else could have imagined whatever they wanted to imagine. But the apostles certainly knew. And I think they take the forefront of that miracle. So that doesn't make sense, that they would be resisting the temptation of the devil. I don't think that that's a choice at all. Changing the water to wine, John chapter 2. And none of those seem to fit. So I think it is the healing of the Sabbath in John chapter 5 is the corresponding text. Well, let's spend a moment talking about righteous judgment. John chapter 7 and verse 24. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So what is it that Jesus is saying here? What can we learn from this? All right, do not judge hypocritically. Why do we say do not judge hypocritically? All right, judge yourself. But in the text, what's the hypocritical judgment?
Jesus points out how hypocritical they were because they would do things on the Sabbath. Superseded not the word. Use that argument against them. That was hypocritical in themselves.
So you're willing to perform circumcision on the 8th day, even if the 8th day presides on the Sabbath day. You're willing to make your offerings and sacrifices on the Sabbath day. And pull an ox out of the ditch. But then when I've made a broken man well again, you're seeking to kill me. That's the hypocritical judgment that Jesus is demonstrating there for them. That's what I believe he is definitely manifesting and showing to them. Let me share with you Linsky's statement here. I appreciated him. He said, Jesus told his opponents, stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. Hearing that Jesus had healed a man on the Sabbath, they jumped to the conclusion that Jesus was a Sabbath breaker, but their judgment was wrong. Jesus was making a man perfect or whole in the same way as circumcision makes a man perfect. They needed to understand this so that they might learn to make right judgment. So it's not just do not make hypocritical judgments, but when we make righteous judgment, what are we doing? All right, we're going to have book, chapter, verse. We're going to look at all of the evidence that is laid out before us, and then we're going to make the righteous judgment from that. So let's look at an example of righteous judgment in the text. Turn back, if you're there in John chapter 7, look with me at verse 14, beginning. But when it is now the midst of the feast, Jesus went up to the temple and began to teach. The Jews then were astonished, saying, how has this man become learned, having never been educated? So Jesus answered them and said, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from myself. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Let's practice righteous judgment in that section. All right, Brother Man?
These people should have known the Old Testament enough to see that Jesus was fulfilling each scripture as a perfect Messiah.
And so I want to be more lenient with them. And simply the reason I want to be more lenient is because I want to be lenient toward myself. Is that I may not always understand all the scriptures, because there's times and places I'm thinking specifically of, if I'm reading Hosea chapter 1, I'm not thinking one bit about the people who are not mine will be called mine as being God saying this is the inclusion of the Gentiles in the gospel age. I would have never made that connection. But thinking about what Jesus says, just looking at, here Jesus says, do not judge according to the appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Going back just earlier in the text, how does one know that Jesus is the true teacher? You look at the evidence.
And he had said in John 5 that one of the witnesses that he was from his Father were the works that he did. He called all the witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
The Father bore witness of him, the miracles bore witness of him, the Old Testament scriptures bore it. All these witnesses should have led them to the right conclusion.
And I think that's the point. I think Jesus in verse 24 is really a culmination of, I've given you everything that is necessary to make the righteous judgment. Brother Matt.
Yes, the first phrase of verse 17, if anyone wills to do his will, he shall know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about the attitude. If they're desiring to know what God's will is, they will know who Jesus is.
All right. Thank you. Take everything Matt just said. Now let's make the modern day application. How will we know that truth is being taught? We have to take the evidence. We have to show the fruits that are born have to be judged. But the one who intends, the one who desires to do the will of the Father, the truth will be shown to him. The truth will be understood. It's not because the truth it requires some higher degree. Again, it doesn't. Look at me. You don't have to have an MDiv or a PhD in doctrinal theological seminaries to be able to preach the gospel. So that was the exact point that I really wanted to make with that.
That ties into the end of the chapter, where the Pharisees basically, or the leaders basically tell the officers that, well, none of us believe in him.
Mm-hmm.
These commoners, they don't really know anything.
Well, they're the uneducated. And then you really see a clergy laity in John chapter 7 that, again, really could be seen in the world today, where you have the clergy telling the laity what they are supposed to know, and the laity being lazy and not learning for themselves. All right. One other, before we go back to the true and false questions, looking at the end of the chapter, who are we introduced to again? Or who reintroduces himself into the text? Nicodemus. And Nicodemus does what? He makes the same argument that Jesus made earlier in the chapter. Here you're wanting to accuse this man to kill him, but our law does what? It requires evidence. Exactly. So all of this, throughout this chapter is just one thematic from John's mind. All right, so now we're looking at the true and false. This is where we're going to kind of jump around in the text that is before us. The first was Jesus was received as the Messiah by most individuals in Jerusalem. All right, so I got a nope. False. All right. Why do we say he's not received by most individuals?
It seems like a whole lot of them just couldn't make up their mind on where to go. That's what it seems to me.
Yeah, they're kind of tossed around. So remember with me that in John's gospel, there's something that's always underlying in John's gospel, and that is the man, the prophet, and the Christ.
Come to the conclusion that the prophet
Mm-hmm.
and the Messiah. And I think that's where the line is.
But making that leap. Now, some of them definitely make the leap to verse, where is it? They do not know that he is the Christ. Verse 26. I think that's a key, is all throughout John's gospel, the movement of the individuals that John pays closest attention to. You can watch it through the text. They always go from seeing Jesus as a man to seeing Jesus as a prophet to seeing Jesus as the Son of God or as the Christ, the Messiah. You see that throughout. You even see it in this chapter. In verse 12, they saw Jesus as what? A man. But just in verse 17, he tells them that he is the what? He is the prophet, the teacher. And then this ties in especially later in verse 40. This certainly is the prophet. That is, that Jesus is the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 18. But the point of Jesus being the Son of God is not going to come until John chapter 8, which John chapter 8 is just a continuation of the same day. All right. So, did most believe at this time? No. They're not there yet. Well, most people are aware of the plots to kill Jesus. False. Why would we say false? Because when Jesus says in verse 19, why do you seek to kill me? The crowd, again, the crowd here is all of those who have come to Jerusalem. They respond with what? Who's seeking to kill you? You have a demon. Who's seeking to kill you? That's where knowing these different groups and being able to distinguish that helps me at least as I journey through the text. So most people were aware. No, it's false. Most people were not aware. Most accepted Jesus' teaching even though it condemned them. I think it's false too, Brother Floyd. I think it's false because Jesus says this. In John chapter 3 and verse 19, he says, "This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and the men love the darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil." People do not accept Jesus' teaching at this point in time because he was condemning. That's not what's happening, I think, at all at this point in time. All right. The Jewish leaders were persuaded after hearing about the miracles Jesus performed. All right, false. I think the miracles motivated them to move with much more brief action. This certainly is going to be true in Acts chapter 11. When Jesus raises Lazarus, there's no denying what has happened in John chapter 11. I don't know why I keep saying Acts. John chapter 11. So what was the high priest response in John chapter 11? It is better for one man to die than for the whole nation. So the Jewish leaders are not persuaded by hearing the miracles. The miracles are what really is promoting them to move faster in response of trying to kill Jesus.
Verse 48. Have any of the authorities of the Pharisees believed in?
No. All right, many believe that Jesus was a prophet. I have that as true. And verse 4, so I had verse 31, many of the crowd believed in him, and they were saying, when the Christ comes, he will not perform more signs than those which this man is, will he? So they're looking, the crowds are evaluating the evidence. And when they begin to evaluate the evidence, they're going, there's no other way to come to a conclusion than that Jesus is who he says he is. Well, the humility of the Pharisees caused them to believe. All right, we'll just go to the next one. I think we all had the same reaction to that question. Like, the Pharisees' humility didn't really match all the time. All right, some scholars doubted Jesus' credentials. True. That goes back to what we talked about earlier in verses 14 and 15. How is this unlearned man, how is this uneducated coming in and saying these types of things? He's not schooled in our schools of theology. He's not a Hillel or a Shema or any of those types of things. The next one, some believe Jesus was under the influence of demons. True. But again, is this something new to John chapter 7? So who were they more than likely influenced to believe that Jesus was just a man that was provoked by the power of demons? The Pharisees. The Sanhedrin had been saying this all along. The only way that they could counteract the miracles that Jesus was performing is to say, well, Jesus performed those miracles by the power of Beelzebul, by the power of demons. That was the way they tried to counteract it. Well, Jesus pointed out the hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders. True. And we've spent much time there already in the various places that Jesus has done that. Let's think about a couple other things. I know that was the final question. When you look at what Jesus says in verse 24, do not judge according to the appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Does that remind you of any other verses? All right, Matthew 7, 1 through 5. Judge lest you be judged. In that whole context, you'll know them. What about 1 Samuel 16 in verse 7? Samuel's told to go
Choosing the new king.
the new king. The kingdom's going to be taken from Saul, 1 Samuel 15, because he did not destroy the Amalekites. And as such, the new king is going to be anointed. Well, how is that new king chosen? Samuel, go to the house of Jesse and do not look at the appearance, for God sees what? The heart. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12, the living word of God is living and it is able to do what? Divide the bone, the marrow, the thoughts and intentions of the... What has God always desired? The heart. Because when we go before God in judgment, God's going to judge us based upon what? The evidence of our lives. And I think that's an application that we can make there. You think about Revelation 21 and opening up the books? Matt? Is that what you turned to? Oh, I saw Matt. I thought me and him were, we had that ESPN going on. All right. Any other comments, questions on John chapter 7?
Well, the way you find truth is the same way you always find truth. You have to examine the evidence and see what the fruit of the evidence tells you. And that's why humans, in a lot of cases, are not good sources for truth. So, the influence in Jerusalem, the religious leaders were in their ear all the time. That's why he had to go out of Jerusalem for people to hear, because they were getting contradicting stories within Jerusalem.
And I appreciate you doing that, because what that really does is that brings us back to the beginning of our study with John chapter 7 and the brothers. Why does Jesus stay private versus public? Because of the influence of the false teachers. Well, thank you so much for your kind attention. I would recommend the bulletin article for this week by Sewell Hall, written in 1995.